thanks for staying with us. Let's take a look at issues now around the DNA backlog. Of course, you've seen Parliament saying that it is behind the new, DNA bill. And of course, this bill is seen as one that could actually assist in solving some of the complicated crimes and even maybe assist with some of the court cases. But how far does it go in order to try and ensure that, South Africa really gets over some of the cases that it really needs to really solve, but at the same time to increase the prosecution rate? Let's speak now to Ian Cameron, Action Society Community Safety Director. Ian, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. What would this bill, for example, mean in terms of the collection of DNA?
Thank you very much. In short, it basically means that any Schedule 8 offender, which is typically a murderer, rapist, serious criminals, serious violent criminals, would need to have DNA samples or swabs taken from them right when they are arrested. So in that whole arrest process, they will then immediately have to submit a DNA sample, and that sample will not only be used in the case, should they then be, for example, prosecuted with a specific charge, but it would also be used to populate the National Forensic Database, which is, of course, very important for future reference in terms of criminal cases.
Does it help, though, when you're populating on, the database, does it help with solving some of the cold cases that we've seen?
Absolutely, it can help. Unfortunately, in the last few years, actually within the last 2-3 years, the Department of Justice freed almost 100,000 Schedule 8 offenders, so rapists and murderers, without having taken any DNA samples. And that's why this bill is so incredibly important. And that's why we really hope that it will finally be passed within the next few weeks. It can obviously help to further link criminals to other crimes, but unfortunately our DNA database is lacking currently. I think that's the first point that's important. And as you rightly mentioned earlier, we still have a severe DNA backlog, which obviously means that this could and most likely will cause a further bottleneck when it comes to the processing of any forensic evidence specifically related to DNA.
I'll get to the backlog in just a moment, because the ministry talking about setting itself a target of 6 months in order to, clear that. But let's talk about that in just a moment. I'm keen to find out from you, part of what, we're also seeing here is that it might also be mandatory for prisoners to give a sample while they're serving their prison term or before they are released. And as you mentioned there that, the freeing of some of these Schedule 8 offenders, I wonder if, one, could we see some of the prisoners themselves saying no to being swabbed?
I think we might see a few people, a few prisoners or convicted felons get upset about it, but I don't think it's something that they can really fight. Once this becomes law, then it becomes law. Then it's a bill that's gone through all the necessary processes, and that's why several checks and balances are in place. I think there's a perception that it's been completely passed because it's been accepted or rather adopted by the National Assembly, or that they've approved it, but now remember, it still must go through the National Council of Provinces. After that, it must go to the president to be signed. So there are still some processes in place. And once that has been done, I think all the checks and balances, or all rather protocols, have been followed to make sure that it is fair. And obviously, this is a crucial step that will help us in future to not only prevent further violent crime, but to also combat and catch perpetrators that might commit violent crimes again.
And Ian, we spoke about this earlier, which is, the DNA backlog. Police saying that they're setting themselves a 6-month target, and they say they've managed to bring it down somewhat in terms of the backlog. They are, of course, processing, more DNA. But one of the things, though, that we've also seen in the public domain is that others are calling for private companies to get involved in order to try and assist the police to be able to really clear this backlog once and for all, because it really compromises some of the cases that are already in the courts. For you, where do you think the bottleneck then is, because as you say, if this bill is passed, more swabs would come in, but they still would not be processed.
Absolutely. So the last data that we've actually heard or seen was the answer that was given to DNA for Africa, that the backlog was standing at around 58,000 cases or dockets that needed to be assessed. In those 58,000, you would look at an average of about 4 pieces of evidence. So it's quite a few that still needed to be processed. And remember, it's a ring-fenced amount. So it doesn't include cases. Since we started with a 300,000 case backlog, it doesn't include current cases that continuously kept on rolling in as crimes were committed. So obviously that is very, very worrying. And I believe it could cause a further bottleneck. I think it's a perfect opportunity for public-private partnerships to be brought in, where government works with the private sector and with universities. You know, the University of Stellenbosch, University of KZN, etc., were already on the cards saying that partnerships would be formed, but it didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? It seems that there's no political will to really solve this. And again, DNA is an incredibly important part of closing the criminal justice circle, or making sure that justice is served.
All right, Ian, thank you so much for that. Do appreciate it. Let's see if it does cross these hurdles, and if, in fact, at some point really gets to be signed into law. That's Action Society Community Safety Director Ian Cameron.